everyone, and welcome to a special episode of The Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Tonight's episode will be a little different, a little longer. Our stories will focus on the deep woods, as well as the cryptids that can often be found in those deep woods. So, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? I saw a creature on my way back from church that made me lose faith. For context, this was about 2017, 2018, when I went to Wednesday church, where they'd pick us up in church vans and take us to the church from 7 to 10 p.m. So a normal night happens, and soon we all hop into the van to go home. I'm talking about 6 rows full of kids and 3 adults. I'm in the second row with my sister and a woman that we'll call Sister Blair. And when we take people home, we start with those who are furthest away and go down the list. At this time, I'm in Ohio, so back roads, and it's completely dark except for some streetlights. We are in the town, so we're usually last to go home, and I've been going to this place since I was a child. Not anymore, but that's a different story. So we are down about half of the kids, and we're going down a street that I ride almost every day, so I think nothing of it. Then I hear my sister point out something in the road. Now, bear with me here as I try to explain this freaking creature that isn't anything human. This thing terrified me so much, it's the reason I lost faith. In the middle of the road is this thing. It's got a human body, very skinny, like all bones. And the way that it was bent is so hard to explain, so picture a man's body, maybe 80 pounds at most, doing a crab walk, but his hands are twisted backwards, and same with his feet. Like you can see the skin that's wrapped around the arms and the legs. And that's not the worst thing. The worst thing was his head. It wasn't a human head. It was like those horse masks, but the neck was twisted around so much, it was like a rope. And it's staring at us. But like a horse dead staring at you with no life. Kind of like a deer in headlights. In these 5 seconds, we slammed on the brakes and kind of all looked at it as it essentially crab walks with its backwards legs first into the side of the road. So it walks into the hillside of the road and then just disappears under like 4 trees. With no words, the driver starts driving again, and Sister Blair just tells us all to grab hands and close our eyes. Then she says a prayer for about 5 minutes. We all went on together, and I've never seen it again. This was in the afternoon, late May of this year. I remember it was later in the afternoon, early evening, but it was a slightly overcast and gray day, so I can't tell you from memory if it was dusk or earlier. I live near a nature conservation area in the Central Florida area. My husband and I were very fortunate to find our property, ample acreage, heavily wooded to the point where we cannot see our neighbors or any lights from their homes. We lovingly call our home the swamp. I was outside in our driveway, which is the only cleared space on our land, save for a natural circular clearing in our woods. I was walking back to our porch when, for some reason, I was compelled to turn and look back to the tree line, around 80 to 100 feet away from our house. I do want to note that there was not a single ounce of fear in me. In fact, I was quite calm when I made eye contact with it. At first, I didn't register what I was looking at. I knew it was an owl, which for my woods is not an uncommon sighting. But then it kind of shifted, and I saw more of it. It was not just an owl. It was the head of an owl on what I can only describe as the shoulders of a human. And it looked like it were wearing a dark cloak, either made of dark foliage or feathers. It was tall, and from the trees around it, I guessed around 7 foot or so. It just looked at me, and I looked at it. I looked around and blinked, sincerely thinking it was a trick of the lighting or my mind creating a thing where there was nothing. But no, when I looked back, it was still there, calm and unmoving. I myself was still unafraid, which is not normal for me as I can freak myself out easily. For some reason, I felt another urge, this time to nod. I nodded towards it, like I was showing my acknowledgement of it. It felt natural and the right thing to do, so then I turned and went into my house. I did not go back outside that day, but the next morning, I went back outside and stood in the same place on my porch to look at what it may have been. And there was nothing I could even remotely try to place as it. The space where it stood was between 2 trees at the opening to the forest line, leading back to the small clearing. There were no low-hanging branches, no large leaves, no anything that I could trick myself into believing was what I had actually seen. I have not seen it since then. I did some mild searching on the internet, but found nothing even remotely close to it. So I just let it go. Until today, when I'd heard another story about it an hour ago. Does anyone know what this might be? Has anyone else in Central Florida or anywhere seen anything like this? This happened almost 10 years ago. I'd made friends with a guy that I worked with, and we got to talking about fishing one day, and he'd offered to take me night fishing. It was something I'd never done before, on account of usually fishing alone, not wanting to be alone in the water, in the dark. But I'd always heard that it was the best time to catch the big ones, so I was really looking forward to the trip. Since the fishing spot was just a mile or so from my friend's house, we met there and headed out. After passing through a hefty gated entrance, we'd reached our destination. The spot was very nice and quiet. A perfect secluded area to do some fishing. There was no house on the property, just some trees and a dock with my friend's boat. He'd explained earlier that he had an agreement with one of the landowners to use the property to store his boat. He could fish at the dock, even camp on their property. In exchange, he'd fix their cars, maintain the property itself, which really just meant keeping the gates closed and doing some yard work. A sweet deal, as he'd say. The property line was surrounded by a very tall fence that went through some of the trees on one side, wrapping all the way around to where there was a different but equally as heavy-duty gated entrance to the dock. It was probably 10:30 at this point. So we grabbed all of our gear and started to head to the dock. Before we even got to the boat, we stopped. We heard something walking in the dark to the side of us. I must have looked a bit nervous because my friend turned around and said, "Most things can't get past this fence." He gestured toward the top of the one we just crossed through to get to the dock. And I could see that it was lined with barbed wire. But toward the back of the property, I know the fence dips down low enough for some critters to make their way. Probably just a deer. Once on the dock, with the gate closed, I felt better. I've been in the woods all my life, but I'll be honest and say I didn't usually spend time there at night. We started to set up on the dock. We decided that we wouldn't take the boat out unless we weren't getting any action on the dock. Best to try the waters while they're calm first. We were baiting our lines when we both heard something climb the fence. Deer don't climb fences, I thought immediately and turned in the direction of the fence behind us. When my friend turned his flashlight toward the fence, it was shaking, but nothing was on it. Not even 30 seconds later, we hear it again. Coming from much further down, something climbing the fence. We both had our flashlights out now, facing the direction where we heard the noise. We could see that something was perched on the fence. It was huge. Couldn't be a bird. Oh, hell no, I heard my friend yell. The thing jumped down. It was a good 6 feet tall. I don't know if it was running or flying. I still have no idea, but it was headed in our direction quickly. Just throw your shit in the boat, man. Let's go. We no longer had lights on the thing, but we could see a pair of red eyes, about 6 feet off the ground, still making its way to us. We threw our shit, ran out the gate, hopped in the truck, and started to take off toward the main entrance. We heard what sounded like someone or something hit the top of my friend's truck. He floored it and started to zigzag back and forth, trying to launch whatever was on top of the truck off. Everything felt insane in this moment. And I remembered the front gate. It was closed and locked. We were going to have to get out of the truck. Oh, fuck. Okay. My friend starts. I'm going to throw this thing into park, hop out, you hop in the driver's seat. I'll run, unlock the gate, hop in as you drive out. Quickly, my friend, quickly, okay? I nod and get into position to switch over. My friend parks, and I see him take off for the fence. Now, in the driver's seat, I start to drive forward. I don't look, but I swear I can see a pair of red eyes in the rear view. The fence is open now. As I drive through, my friend hops in the bed of the truck. Drive, drive! I'm now flooring it, not looking at anything but the road in front of me. I hear my friend through the open window, telling me to go ahead and pull over. I pulled over under one of the few streetlights I saw on the side of the road. Both my friend and I were expecting to see some damage on the top of the car from the hit. But there was no dent, no scratches, no markings in the dirt that covered the top of the truck. When we got back to my friend's house, he said this thing for sure had wings. Definitely not a deer. I don't know what that thing was, man, but I could see clear as day when I laid in the back of my truck. It was a monstrous all-black thing in the sky with those same red eyes, man. No idea what we saw, but it was enough to scare me into never going back there again. I asked my friend to just grab my stuff whenever he ended up back out there. I think he understood my hesitation, considering it took quite a while for him to make the short trip himself.
I wouldn't classify this as a terrifying story. I would consider this more in the realm of unexplained, and at least for me and in my life, intriguing. To set the scene, I am 12 years old at the time. It's a family reunion, the month of December. It wasn't snowing where we were in California, but it was very cold. All my family were inside. They were going to start a fire, and then we'd begin our official family game night. I always loved coming out to my aunt and uncle's house because they were so much further away from the city than our home. We lived in LA. Their home was in Joshua Tree. Surrounding my family's house was only small trees, smooth, rocky hills, and the desert, essentially. There weren't any other houses immediately in view. There also just weren't many people out there. So I was still outside. I wasn't riding my four-wheeler around anymore, but I was sitting on top of it, just taking in the night before going in to join the rest of my family. Sitting there, I saw something moving in the distance. I couldn't really see it at all, but it did kind of look like someone, or something walking on two legs. At the time, I was sure that it was just the moonlight hitting whatever this was, but it was all white, and it cast a shadow. As far as I could tell, it had no arms, and it moved rather slowly. It moved almost as though it was in slow motion. I started to walk in the direction of the thing, and as the house moved out of my line of sight, and more of the horizon was in my view, I could see that there was another one, slightly smaller and trailing just a bit behind the other one. It was behind, but it was still moving slowly and calmly. As my eyes adjusted even more, it wasn't like it made more sense, but I was gaining more details about the thing I was seeing. The things. Very thin legs, resembling more like how a bird has tall, skinny legs, but they weren't bird legs. They were completely straight. The creature had no wings. It was like sticks covered in a sham. Not a transparent one. As a 12-year-old, I genuinely thought maybe I was looking at two moving ghosts, but more like the Halloween version of a ghost than a ghostly person. Again, there were no arms. I guess Casper was my best reference at the time. Casper on stilts with no eyes. I think that it can be easier to draw sometimes than what I'm describing, and I've done that many times. It's not that the drawings are so much detailed, because describing or drawing, I still don't know what their faces looked like. Everything was just white. I watched them for a good while, and they just sort of glided. No bending of the knees. Just two of them, making their way over the rocky hills. It was only then that I considered running in to grab someone, once they were out of sight. Originally, I didn't want to miss anything, but in that moment, I realized that I'd likely lost any hope of somebody validating what I'd been watching. I couldn't see them any longer, so I went inside for the fire and games. Though I never saw them again, and I still haven't to this day, I did get a chance to ask my uncle about them that night. He told me that he didn't know what it was that I saw, what they were, but he was pretty sure that he'd seen them before too. He told me the first time was a few years ago, and he'd only caught a glimpse of them. But then, the second time, he'd gotten a decent look, and there were two, one bigger and one smaller, just as I had seen. He asked if I too felt like they were peaceful, and I thought about that for a moment, and I decided that I guess I did think that. I told him that I wasn't scared, that yes, I felt they were peaceful, especially when I saw that there were two of them, one smaller and one bigger. He told me that, yeah, he agreed, and that he decided a while ago that maybe they were part of this land and this place, either protecting or maybe just coexisting with us. Even now, I still think he's probably right. That place always did feel special, and it still does. We had to cancel this year's reunion, which sucks, but usually every year my uncle and I will stay outside a bit longer than everyone else, just to see if we can get a glimpse. It's been about 12 years since my first and only sighting, but I'm pretty confident these things are still out there. I think they were here before us, and for some reason I just think that they'll be here after us too. Anyways, that's my story. Sorry I don't have more information on what exactly these are. A family of Bigfoot used to live on my aunt and uncle's property in eastern Washington. From the back patio of the house, I'd watch them with binoculars as they'd casually travel in and out of the forest clearing, sometimes carrying large branches with them. back and forth. There were 4 members in this Bigfoot family. They all had thick brown fur and ranged in size, the largest Bigfoot easily being close to 8 feet tall. Over the years, as they became more aware and comfortable with our presence there, the sightings of them became more and more frequent as they'd go about their routines. They never tried to contact or interact with us, and we sure never tried to approach them either. We were happy spectating safely from 100 or so yards away. My uncle was able to amass quite a collection of tapes that he'd recorded from his handheld camcorder. He had a shoebox filled with stacks of grainy footage that he was able to capture over the years, and he was proud to play them for any neighbors or family that would stop in. Back in the 1980s, there was no YouTube that you could put your videos on for the world to see. Back then, when you recorded a video, your audience was whoever you could fit in your living room to watch it. He even went as far as giving the Bigfoot family names: Tim, Tom, Lucy, and Bill. Bill was the biggest. Lucy was a bit shorter, and Tim and Tom were equal height. And my uncle swears he could identify and separate each member's tone when we'd hear them communicating with each other. We all knew Bill's roar because it was the deepest and loudest, levels above the other grunts and hollers that would echo through the trees. But most of the time, the Bigfoot family stayed silent. One humid July night, we heard Bill let out a sound that shook our windows. Then, all of them started going wild. My uncle barges into my room asking if I hear what's going on outside and if I can see anything out my window. It's dark, but by the little glow provided by the moon, I can see none of the Bigfoot are in the 100-yard clearing. My uncle tells me to stay in my room as he fumbles to put a new tape in the camcorder and rushes out the back door. Then, from my window, I watch my aunt join him on the patio while he anxiously pans his camera across the tree lines as the forest continues to emit sounds of chaos. In a gasp of shock, I hear my aunt point out something running through the branches fast. My uncle turns his camera, and we see either Tim or Tom rip into the clearing from the trees. He's screaming wildly and coming right for the house. My uncle doesn't budge. He keeps his camera fixed on the fast-approaching Bigfoot. I put my face against the glass and watch this creature get about 50 yards from the house, when it suddenly collapses, lifelessly, into the grass. Then I notice another figure emerge from the tree line, but this one doesn't resemble a Bigfoot. It was much smaller. From my view, this new figure walking toward the Bigfoot looked like a human. As the figure neared, its head jerked up in the direction of my aunt and uncle. This made them both dash inside and lock the doors. They both came into my room, and we watched as this figure grabbed the Bigfoot's legs and dragged it back into the darkness. One by one, the shouts and roars became fewer and fewer, until the forest was silent again. The next day, there's a knock on the front door. I'm sitting in the kitchen eating cereal, and my uncle answers it. From the kitchen table, I see standing in the doorway are 2 men in black suits and fedoras. They look identical to one another: pale skin, sunken blue eyes, no eyebrows. Their faces completely hairless. Their appearance scares me enough that I take my cereal into my uncle's room to eat it in there. Moments after I close the door to continue to eat, my uncle opens the door. I greet him and tell him I won't spill cereal on their bed, but he ignores me. His eyes don't even look over at me. Walking past the bed, he makes his way to the closet, where I see him retrieve his shoeboxes of tapes. He maintains his glossy stare as he exits the bedroom. Following behind him, I poke my head out the door and watch him hand the shoeboxes to the scary men. When they leave, the dazed look on my uncle's face fades away, but he immediately becomes violently ill and spends the remainder of the day asleep on the couch. Later, when I tried to ask about the two men in suits, my uncle wouldn't give me any more information besides those men needed my tapes. Any further questions of mine were met with, "I don't know, but it's best we don't concern ourselves with it." My aunt and uncle passed away in the early 2000s, without me ever getting more answers. We didn't talk about the event or the Bigfoots after that. I still live on the property in eastern Washington, but have never had a Bigfoot encounter since that night. And if I do, I don't think I'll be filming it. Years ago, before my partner and I were married, we'd inherited a camper from a family friend and decided that early, before summer, we would take some vacation time to break it in. Since we always traveled with our dogs and 2 cats, we like to find spots that are slightly hidden and away from active roadways. This was perfect since we naturally enjoyed small towns, ghost towns, if you will. Originally from Montana, that's where this story takes place. We had just stopped at a gas station around Missoula, Montana, and were headed to Garnett, Montana, which was about an hour away. We'd asked our friends who were familiar with the area if there were camping spots that fit our general expectations. And since they were outfitters from the Billings area, they suggested something a bit more secluded. So far, we'd been successful driving across Montana, picking a town and camping near it just for a night. This was about a week into our trip, and up to this point, nothing creepy had happened at all. A lot of nature and a lot of history. That was about it. But I was especially excited for Garnett. We continue forward towards the mountain range our friends had told us about, and we see the markings they'd mentioned to keep an eye out for. It was essentially 2 giant boulders next to a dirt path on the right-hand side of the road. It was just past the last sign for Garnett, but not quite as far. As we make our drive up the back side of the mountain, off the main road, I see a couple abandoned cars and a few run-down houses. Clearly uninhabited, one would think. Nothing too weird or out of the ordinary for towns that we've known to have been populated but are no longer. But I can't shake the pit in my stomach. It's growing. We get further up and past what looks like an old parking area for some business that could have potentially been there at one point, but no building. The higher we drive, the more my instinctual unease kicks in. You know, fight or flight mode. Adding to this feeling, my dogs start to go nuts. Of course, at first I wrote it off as them needing to get out. They sensed that we were slowing down, perhaps. So we finally find a flat spot of land, and I realized my partner and I hadn't spoken the whole drive up. Probably 45 minutes. He goes to get out of the car to see if it's level, and just as he did, I grabbed his hand. The dogs barking like crazy, whining, and the cats pacing side to side. I ask him, "Please don't turn off the lights." I think I saw eyes before we stopped. He just looks at me confused. He says that he doesn't know why he has to, but he'll leave the cabin lights on because he's got to go check outside. Completely missing the eyes comment. When he gets out, all I can think about is how it's watching. Then all I can think about is that I don't even know what it is, but I'm sure that I saw eyes, possibly red eyes. And I felt that they were following our movements. I couldn't help but think that our animals thought that too. One of our dogs is focused on my partner, whining excessively and then scratching to get out, then looking back at my partner. When he gets back in, I tell him not to let the dogs out yet, and he says, "We should just go. Something isn't right." We camp a lot, and I get a bit spooked sometimes, but for as long as I've known him, my husband never does. Even when I get scared, we usually hang out and relax, and then it's fine. We've never left a spot because I've been alarmed by something. So when he said we should go, I knew that he felt it too, that flight feeling. We began to head down a different road, a paved one, towards I-90, driving very fast. And as fast as we were driving, I could still hear a rumble, like something very large was running or driving behind us. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the dogs were in the way, and the tint in the camper was so dark. You can't see well at night, but whatever it was, our dogs and cats were fixated on it, and the tension was growing. I could see that it wasn't a car. Suddenly, the dogs are pacing, the cats meowing, scratching to get out as we're driving at high speeds. Now my partner and I are bickering, not really about anything and not seriously, basically just about what we don't understand. Then it starts to snow, hard, out of nowhere. It's nearing the end of May, almost June, so definitely weren't expecting snowfall quite like this. We grow quieter as we come around to a turn, the rumble growing closer to us from behind and louder as we try to slow the vehicle. And just as we rounded the turn, a large, stark white rabbit dashes in front of the camper, and we hit it instantly, surely killing it. As I see its condition in the rear view, a hush fell over all of us, all the way until we got down the mountain and onto a side road. All the anxiety we felt was gone. The cats were calm, the dogs were settled in. Cut to our new camping spot, which was a short drive from where the snowstorm and chase had been. I didn't know if my partner noticed the chase or if he was just super focused on the road. But either way, we all felt safe now. And in this new spot, we experienced zero creepiness until the next day. It had stopped snowing while we slept, but still cold enough to where you could see our footprints from the night before, snow having not yet melted away. As we're driving back into Garnet, on the paved mountain road we came in on, we noticed the point when we ascend the mountain, where we were just before we hit the rabbit the night before. Suddenly, we both start feeling nervous. I looked at my husband after we made the big turn and I said, "Where's the rabbit?" It was gone. No carcass, no blood, no tracks, no trace it had been there at all. We agreed that something could have gotten it, but absolutely no trace in the white snow. Very strange. We were the only tire tracks, as far as I could tell, on the trail, and the snow wasn't deep enough to have buried the animal at the end, because we could see our distinct tracks from the previous night. Just no rabbit tracks. No rabbit. So, we get to the ghost town of Garnet and we're talking to the rangers about the strangeness on the mountain, about the bad feeling we had, that I had, and about the rabbit. One of the men says, "Yeah, there's something up here, for sure." While another says, "I wouldn't stay by myself at night." And then he sort of smiles and says, "What exactly did you see or feel?" So, I tell him that I felt fear, a primal fear. I felt whatever I was hearing, what I was afraid of, was not human. I told him that I didn't think it was a ghost, and that it wasn't a crazy person, as it kept speed with our vehicle and sounded as if it was on all fours. I told them that as strange as it may sound, I felt like this thing wanted to eat us. The animals, for sure, but also me and my partner. I felt like we were being momentarily hunted. I also pointed out that at one point, I thought I saw its red eyes, but I couldn't be sure. That was when I asked my husband to keep the cabin light on when he went outside, just before he said that we should leave. He looked at me and then at the men, saying, "I felt it the moment I got out of the car. After that, everything is sort of a blur until the rabbit incident." One of the men takes a deep breath while looking at the other and says, "There's a Wendigo up here. Do you know what that is?" I didn't, but when he described the lore, I about cried. That was exactly what I felt. The feelings they invoke, the damage they try to cause, internally, externally. After hearing it all, I was 100% sure that those eyes were the eyes of a Wendigo. One that tried to get us somehow. Even crazier, it didn't. Now, skip to a few months later. Since the Rangers mentioned Navajo in their explanations to me about the Wendigo, I decided to tell our story to my stepdad. He's someone who is very much into history, especially Native American history. So he lets me finish and then says, "You two know what rabbits are, right? What they symbolize?" Of course I did not, so we both shake our heads, no. He continues, "Rabbits are often believed to be warrior spirits. And they say that when the rabbit comes, he's fighting for you. That rabbit sacrificed himself for you guys that night." A chill ran over me, and my husband too. He looked at me and said, "After the rabbit, the Wendigo, it stopped chasing us." Being someone who has experienced what I consider to be true paranormal experiences, I'm also pretty skeptical. I'm not quick to trust my eyes, but my ears are super keen. They've always been my strongest sense. This was an experience I had as a farm veterinarian about 6 years ago while working on the East Coast. I was out in the fields with the cows. The farm had several new calves, so this time I was really just playing more than working. The property was huge, and just to reach the cows, I'd usually ride my horse out to them. So this was just before I decided to ride back to the main house and get back to my office. It was nearing 5 p.m., so lighting was decent. I say this because I always anticipated my next paranormal experience would be like my previous, taking place in the dark, at night, alone. However, before hopping on my horse, I hear something coming from the tree lines, just over the fence about 30 yards away from where I'm standing. It sounds like a puppy that's in distress. It's whining. My veterinarian brain instantly kicks in, and I hop on the horse, ushering her to ride over to the fence. When we arrive, I open the back gate and attempt to walk my horse into the woods, but she wouldn't budge. After having a standoff with my horse, she wins. I decide to close the gate and walk into the woods. I can still hear the whining as I'm going to do this. I look back and my horse is incredibly anxious. She was well trained. In fact, she was one of the horses I'd use for lessons during that time. She was the only thing that had indicated to me something could be wrong. I dismissed this, thinking that she was likely anxious because she could also hear the puppy whining. I kept walking towards the whining, now calling for the pup myself. As I try to pinpoint where the sound is coming from, I realize that it seems to be moving. I stay in place, and sure enough, I can hear the whining moving around the forest, first closer, and then further away from where I am. I close my eyes and try to narrow it down. Then I hear something rustling around to my left. I open my eyes and start walking in that direction. It sounds like something is whining and digging through leaves, dirt. I feel confident that I'm going to find this puppy as it sounds closer and closer as I keep walking. Then, just behind a tree, I see something that makes me stop in my tracks. An animal, partially covered by a large patch of bushes. A creature. It's hunched over, facing the opposite direction. I wasn't right next to it, but from this viewpoint, I could see that it wasn't a puppy at all. This thing was easily 4 feet tall, in a crouching position. It had hair, but patchy, and it looked like wires, very coarse and dark. The hair was not covering the creature's pale skin entirely, as I could see it. The best way to describe how it looked was that of an ape, except it wasn't stocky like one. Instead, it seemed very skinny and fragile. But it was making the sounds. And as I froze in place, it continued to make the sounds. It hardly moved except to tilt its head up when making the whining sounds. It was clearly visible that this creature was making the sound, but even more terrifying, it was making the sound from a stationary position, but I could hear it moving in different directions, just as it had been doing when I first entered the forest. The frozen fear subsided, and I decided that I needed to get back to my horse, then back to the property to tell the owners what I'd seen, though I wasn't sure what I had seen. Instead of slowly backing out of there, I decided to take off running. I figured this thing didn't come after me when I was making all that noise before, and now I'm actually scared and I want to get the heck out of there. I think that was a mistake. Whatever was previously far behind now sounded like it was right behind me, also running. I couldn't decipher which sounds were created by myself and which were coming from the creature. Never looking back, I reached my horse. I don't even bother opening the gate. I leap over the gate instead, cutting my pants in the process. Quickly grab my horse, who is now well on her way to freaking out as well. As soon as I untie her, she takes off running. Not what I had expected, but I took off after her, running in the direction of the property. I never end up catching the horse. I can see that she's well ahead of me now, so I just keep running. Finally looking back, I don't see anything. But as I turn around to run again, I heard a blood-curdling shriek leave the forest and echo throughout the whole area. Not even knowing it was possible to run faster, I did. Out of breath, sweaty, and looking insane, I finally made it to the property. After overcoming the initial fear, I tried to consider what it could have been. Does everything have to be evil? For a moment, I considered every animal that I could think of. I even considered that it was a person. But when I met my horse at the front, where she was patiently waiting near her horse trailer, I remembered how she'd acted the whole time. Horses are smart animals. Sometimes they're even a little bit too smart. But I decided in that moment this old girl would never act that way with just any animal or any person. I give her a nice rub, telling her that I will listen to her from now on as I load her into the trailer. Before taking off, I tell the owners what I saw, try to anyway, asking if they've ever seen anything like that or heard anything like that before. The owners were pretty old, and though they said they hadn't experienced anything like it before, they were going to have the farmhands check the area, make sure the cows were not in any danger. This made me feel better, but I couldn't help thinking about the farmhands. Those were the people that I needed to talk to. The next shift at the farm, that's exactly what I did. And though a few were reluctant to even entertain my story, there was one woman who did. She didn't have much to say, but she looked very serious as she told me, frankly, I do not trust those woods, and you shouldn't either. I heeded her advice and never stepped foot in those woods again. I think I saw a legitimate shapeshifter. I've shared my experience before in hopes that someone out there has an explanation, or maybe has had a similar experience. Well, here's the story. The experience took place during Thanksgiving break. The sighting was later in the evening at about 1 a.m. We'd rented a vacation home in Newport, Oregon, to accommodate not just mine but also my sister's family. They would be flying in later that day from Montana for Thanksgiving. And there would be quite a few of us, too many for my smaller home, which is in the southwest region of Washington state, closest to the Oregon border. We had all arrived at the property around 4 p.m., and at about 7:30, I hear my daughter start to yell for me from the back bedroom. I rushed over, and she said that my 2-year-old grandson had gotten into a case with my blood pressure medication. She was worried that he took some. I counted, and sure enough, one of my pills was missing. Naturally, panic ensued, but not enough to distract us from calling poison control. And my heart just about stopped when they told us to hang up and call 911 right away. When we did, they sent an ambulance and took my grandson to a small but close hospital in the area. My daughter and son-in-law rode in the ambulance, while I followed it to the hospital in my car. When I got there, we were informed that the hospital was not equipped for my grandson's situation and that they'd be transporting him to Children's Hospital near Portland. So, on the eve of Thanksgiving, a pediatric ambulance transported my grandson from Newport to Portland. It's about a 2.5-hour drive in a regular car. The ambulance arrived around midnight to pick up my grandson. My daughter rode in the ambulance with him to Portland. Me and my son-in-law went back to the beach house to get a couple of things: change of clothes, my grandson's blanket, and then we started the drive to Portland around 12:30 a.m. So here's where we encountered something that my son-in-law and I will never forget, yet we'll never really be able to explain either. We'd been on the road for a little over an hour and had just passed a casino on Highway 18. The area, which was just before McMinnville, was filled with hay farms and farmland. The road isn't incredibly well lit and has just 2 lanes. It's definitely a long, deserted road, especially at that hour. The ride had been very emotional. I had felt extreme guilt for having packed my meds in a tote bag where my grandson was able to easily access it. I was terrified for him and crying. My son-in-law was also upset, and although he was trying to hide it, I knew he blamed me. Anyway, here's the crazy part. I noticed my son-in-law slightly drifting in the road. He was falling asleep. More than once, I asked him if he was okay to drive and to be cautious. He said he was fine, and he declined my offers to drive. However, I kept my eyes on him the whole time, only checking back to the road sometimes. We were driving down this road, going almost or just about 60 miles an hour, when in the distance, we both saw what at first we thought was a deer, running in our lane of the road. It was coming straight at us. But within a couple of seconds, we both realized that it wasn't a deer at all, but a large, golden-colored canine of sorts, maybe even a wolf. About 250, 300 feet away at this point, it got closer fast. It had to have been moving at least the speed that we were. As it got to about 150 feet away, it leaped upwards, and right before our eyes, it morphed instantly into a giant white owl. The wingspan stretched past our lane of the road. When recounting the story to our family much later, we both estimated its wingspan was between 12 and 15 feet. It was enormous. As soon as we see that happening, my son-in-law yelled out, "What the hell is that?" and swerved the car to the left, trying to avoid hitting it. But as he did this, the owl immediately landed about 100 feet ahead of us, just on the shoulder of the road. As it landed, we saw it tuck its head and wings into its chest, like it was afraid or trying to hide. As we drove past it, I got a good look at it out the window. I could see that even with its head and wings tucked in, the creature still came up to about the bottom of the window on the Impala. It had the width of an oversized beach ball and was about 3 or 4 feet tall. If this was supposed to be just an owl, then it was a mind-blowingly big owl. Something to note is that right when this event happened, or right after, we both felt like we were in some sort of trance, the same sort of trance-like state. We didn't speak a word the entire rest of the drive. Not until we got to the hospital. We had both lost all the feelings of tiredness and angst. They were replaced with a calm alertness and awareness. I found I wasn't even worried about my son-in-law's driving any longer. The memory of the experience was crystal clear, but the feeling of sheer awe did not hit us until driving back through the same area the next afternoon. It was like we suddenly both said, "Oh, and what the heck was that thing that we saw last night?" And then it all started pouring out of the two of us. My daughter was asking us questions about it, and we were exclaiming the exact same answers at the same time. It was amazing. We both agree that this seemed to be some sort of mythical creature or shapeshifter. We both also agree that whatever it was good, and it meant us no harm, and it may have been a guardian. Or maybe even more likely, it was something that we witnessed by accident, a fluke that maybe we weren't meant to see. Either way, just the fact that we both saw it, I feel extremely lucky to have seen proof with my own eyes that animal spirits or shapeshifters alike do in fact exist, and sometimes even on the same planes that we do. This is the only time I had a threatening, skin-to-skin encounter. In June of 2019, me and a friend had decided with our girlfriends that we were going to go camping. We finally get all our stuff loaded and get in the car and put the address in the GPS. We set off on the trip, and after 3 hours of driving and 45 minutes of hearing my friend and his girl argue, we finally arrive. We get out of the car, and me and my friend begin unloading. After getting my stuff, I start getting my girlfriend's stuff. As I was, my friend was asking his girlfriend why she needed 3 bags for one night. She smiled and opened one of them. It had an ounce of weed, pre-rolls, and other goodies. Now knowing that we had weed, we had to find a place to camp that wasn't near other people. It took until sundown, but we finally found a perfect spot. We decided that after we got everything taken care of, we would eat hot dogs and smoke a blunt. We started to build a campfire to light the area so we could set up our tents, but we ran out of wood in the immediate area. So I said I would go get some while my friend stayed with the girls. I set off on my journey, and after about 2 minutes, I found some sticks to use. I started picking up the sticks, and all of a sudden, I felt someone grab my wrist. I looked up to see a man with a blank expression. For a man, he had surprisingly long fingernails, and he was digging them into my wrist while trying to grab my other wrist. I turned my head to not see his face and screamed for help. My friends shouted a response saying that they were coming. After they shouted, I immediately felt relief in my wrist. I wasn't struggling to keep my arms down, so I turned, and the man wasn't there anymore. I turned and ran as fast as I could, terrified. I met my friends and said that we had to leave immediately. I didn't even explain myself, I just wanted gone. We load up our stuff and take the long walk back. We get to the car and load our bags in. I explained what happened as we were walking back, and it scared them enough to make them want to hustle. I had a picture of my wrist immediately after, but my iPhone broke, and my iCloud wasn't backed up, so I lost that picture. I do have a picture of it now, though. It has since become a scar, which shows just how much force he put on it. I'll post a picture of it on my profile for anyone who's interested in seeing it. It was absolutely terrifying. My partner and I live on the West Coast now. We both grew up on farms in different states on the eastern side of the U.S. And similarly, we couldn't wait to get out when it came time to go to college. This story doesn't take place in Oregon, though. I have yet to experience anything quite like this anywhere else. My family grew up in West Virginia. My grandparents actually still live in the house that my great-grandparents built almost 100 years ago. Their house sits on their farm, my family's farm, which is about 160 acres. The farm naturally isn't close to any other neighbors. The only things living near my grandparents were their animals. They carried cattle and calves, sheep and turkeys, and they also had 2 horses. The farm, their home, was just outside of Point Pleasant, in an even smaller town called Henderson. If you know the history of Point Pleasant, then you know it's a bit dark. It's also heavily embraced by the town itself. Just a few years after this story took place, the town had a giant statue erected in honor of the Mothman. You can say that this came with a mix of emotions, heavily debated, but ultimately, the town knew that it would be good for tourism, which is good money for a small town. But it's not all about the money. The true reason the statue exists is a bit deeper. In 2000, I was about 15 years old. I had been tending to the farm. Specifically, I was shaving the sheep and collecting the wool. The farm was usually pretty quiet, but having the shaver on, all I could hear was the buzzing of the thing. I was getting lost in the job, but I couldn't help but notice that all of the barn cats simultaneously ran out of the barn, like something had scared them. It was all happening very fast, but once they were out of the barn, I watched them scatter in various directions, taking cover under anything that was nearby. The deck, the trucks, the horse trailers. I turned off the shaver because this was unusual. I set it down, closed the gate to the sheep, and started looking around, listening. But it was the usual quiet of the farm. Even though I thought the whole event was strange, I decided to finish working, since nothing was obviously out of place. I figured something must have fallen and just startled them, and that I could check that out later. I got back to shaving the sheep, and was just about done when it began to freak out, being very impatient and making the noises that sheep often do when they are in distress. I stopped shaving and looked around. All of the animals seemed to be a bit uneasy now. The cows were all beginning to make their way towards the fence closest to me, in a hurried way. It's very unusual to see cows act this way. Fast, that is. They're rather docile creatures who sometimes don't even hustle when it's mealtime, because they've been feasting all day on the grass. So why were they hurrying now? I watched as the cows tried to get the calves in front of them. Why were they doing that, I thought. I considered grabbing my grandparents, but before I even had the opportunity, I found myself witnessing something shocking. I looked back to the cows who were getting closer and looking more frantic. I saw something huge and black swoop down. At first, I thought it was a very large bird, but when I saw its massive size, its wingspan, I knew this was no bird. As it swooped down, it appeared to be swinging at the animals, swinging with arms. I knew that no bird in the world had arms in addition to this wingspan, but I didn't scream. Instead, I was silent and I contemplated what to do next. I was worried that if I started to run to the house, I'd be out in the open, prime for picking. So I stayed in the barn with the sheep, who were all acting very strange. Then, the creature swooped down again, but this time, it grabbed a calf. It grabbed the calf with its legs. This thing had legs with sharp claws or talons connected at the ends. They must have been. How else could this creature grab a calf? Calves are of course smaller than cows, but they're still 75, 80 pounds. It was when I saw this happen that the creature's incredible size became more clear. The calf looked rather small in its grasp. Tears started to fill my eyes at this point, and I thought I absolutely had to get inside. I figured the creature was busy, its hands were full, if you will, so I ran for it. I could feel the tears escape my eyes from the wind as I ran, and when I reached the door, I looked back and could see the creature flying off toward the woods near the farm. I got inside, I locked the door, ran to the window, but it was gone. I must have looked like I felt, because when I found my grandma, she asked me what was wrong. She started to call for my grandpa, and once they were both standing there, I tried to explain what happened. Both of them were shocked and saddened to hear about the calf. She was a girl, and just about 5 days old. We cried for a moment, but I asked them, what the heck was that? What did I see? They kept trying to calm me down and tell me not to worry about it. But my grandpa, he had called his friend over, who was with the local police. They searched the general area of the woods, but they found no carcass, no bones, and nothing to show that an animal was attacked. But the calf was missing. I heard my grandpa telling his friend that he thought he'd never see anything like that out here again. That this shit was supposed to be over and done with. My grandpa was angry, and his friend was too. My grandma was quiet, but she looked very concerned. A few minutes after the police left, my mother arrived. She was there to pick me up. She wanted to know what happened, and I went to tell her everything. But then, my grandpa interjected with, "It happened again. A calf this time. A whole fucking calf, Judy." My mom looked shocked, and then she looked at me, asking me if I saw what had happened. But again, my grandpa answered, "She had to see the whole damn thing. Hell, it could have been her. She was just out there, shaving the sheep." My mom looked back at me and hugged me, but I wanted answers, so I sort of shrugged her off and looked at all three of them, demanding that they tell me what was going on. Long story short, my grandparents had lived in Henderson their whole lives. In that time period, they saw the Great Bridge collapse in 1967, when my mom was just 2 years old. It was a huge tragedy, and it is still for a lot of local residents. Lots of families lost loved ones that day. The other thing that took away from these deaths and the tragedy of the bridge collapse was the Mothman itself. News reporters everywhere took on the story. They even went as far as saying that the Mothman himself did this, or that he had predicted this. My grandparents say that in the beginning, no one in their right mind believed this Mothman story until locals started getting together, discussing the collapse and other strange things that had happened in town. Whether it was missing people, missing animals, things were going missing, and a lot of people were seeing the same thing. So the town started taking things a bit more seriously. My grandma told me that 2 of their friends had gone missing later that same year. No foul play, no leads, no bodies, just disappeared without a trace. Their farm had even been left as it was, with a hose running, as though they were in the middle of working, and they disappeared. When my mom was about 12 years old, she too had been working on the farm. At the time, my grandparents also raised horses and gave lessons. My mom was a champion rider, so she spent most of her time with the horses. When this happened, she was out riding, basically just exercising the horses, when she saw something large moving atop the trees. Her horse must have noticed it too, because it stopped. When not in motion, she got a better look. It seemed to be the largest bird that she'd ever seen. But why did its eyes look like that? She had seen owls and other animals with reflective eyes, but this thing had glowing red eyes. You could even see that in the broad daylight. Feeling incredibly uneasy and knowing the legends that surrounded her town, she signaled for her horse to turn around and then to get the heck out of there, fast. She was racing towards the house, too afraid to look behind her. Her horse started to act erratically, and she was worried about getting thrown off. She held on tight and was almost to the barn when she felt something above her. She knew that she couldn't look up, and she just hoped that her horse would keep going. It did, all the way to the stables. Once inside, my mom quickly hopped off and began to make her way to closing the stable doors. She didn't see anything, so she thought that she must have gotten away from it, after all. But her horse was not acting right, still nervous, not staying still. She decided to head inside and grab her parents, tell them what she saw, and to help calm the animals. She was running around the house, trying to find my grandparents, but they were nowhere to be found. Suddenly, she heard the sound of wood crashing, followed by my grandpa yelling wildly outside. Then, a shotgun blast. She ran to the side of the house where the noise was coming from, and she saw her father pointing the shotgun in the sky. And when she looked up, she saw the black creature from the woods. But it wasn't in a tree. It was in the sky, flying away, just as wildly as my grandpa had been screaming. The creature was pretty far away, but my mom said she could see it was carrying something. And it was two things, actually. 2 turkeys had been swooped up. And when she looked over at the coop where they'd all been kept, the entire roof had been ripped off. I had so many questions for my grandparents, for my mom. After they told me this story, I confirmed with them that this is definitely what I saw, that I never got a good look at its face, but the body, it was definitely not a bird. Luckily, I have a family and a partner who believe my story, not to mention a town full of people who would never call this story bullshit. They would never do that because they know someone, or they know someone who knows someone that was somehow affected by the Mothman. Because where I come from, it's not just a superstition. It's fact. And it's when you start to forget about him, or you start to dismiss his existence, that he makes his presence known. And this is the true reason that the statue was erected. Sure, it makes for a good tourism stop, but more than anything, it's there to show the Mothman that the town does believe. To show him that we haven't forgotten, and that we will never forget. Growing up, I had the pleasure of spending a few Thanksgivings and other holidays in the small surrounding areas of Yosemite National Park. Some extended family of mine owned a cabin quaintly tucked away in deep, vast amounts of forest. There was no cable, no cell service, a house phone for emergencies, but yes, basically off the grid with the exception of heating and running water. Anyways, the lack of cable or internet was welcomed and made for some really fun game nights. Time to eat way too much food and just kick back with nature. Though the cabin was lovely and didn't harvest any negative energy, the surrounding areas were especially creepy in the night. Total darkness, total silence, except for the moonlight. Still, I enjoyed going for night walks, especially in the snow. I could be alone, listen to my iPod, and since I was very much a 17-year-old trying to smoke a cigarette without getting in trouble, night walks were perfect. Thanksgiving 2009, I was enjoying one of these night walks. Sticking to the more lit-up roadway versus the wooded path, the roadway being a slightly longer path, but the wooded being now completely dark. Both paths led to the same area. It was an area attached to the property where my cousin's grandfather had built one of those wooden swing sets with a slide, a heavy-duty one. I love that thing because it wasn't one of those cheap ones made only for small kids. It sat in the middle of an open field with a single large cedar tree with a tire swing. Earlier that day, I helped my younger cousins build an igloo, which was in between the two structures, facing the tire swing, the wooded paths, and more deep woods. I decided that it may be a bit disrespectful to smoke completely inside the igloo, so I just laid on my stomach with my head poking out of the igloo entrance. I remember thinking how quiet it was, really serene. The snow, new layers untouched by anything, offering a perfect glow in the dark night. As I went to change the song on my iPod, something caught my eye from the entry of the wooded path I'd opted not to take on my way in. It was in the distance. They were in the distance. I tried to adjust my eyes and see what exactly I was looking at. I saw what had to be a shadow, but what was making the shadow? Still unsure of what I was seeing, I wiggled out of the igloo a bit and focused. It almost looked like a white sheet with sticks for legs. No visible head or eyes, and no arms that I could see. Just two legs, or sticks, or I don't know. There were two of them, one larger than the other, but identical in shape, blending in almost perfectly with the snow. All but their shadow. I remember I wasn't afraid of them. I even thought maybe they were a mother and child of some kind. But I was so unsure of what I was seeing that I couldn't bring myself to move closer to those things. As I watched, they just kept moving along their way, across the field, seemingly unaware of my presence, until they disappeared into the woods just on the other side. Over the years, my curiosity has gotten the better of me, and thanks to the internet, my description, two entities looking like white sheets with sticks for legs, I found claims of the same sightings in California at Yosemite National Park just a year after my experience in 2010. I'm pretty sure what I saw that night was a night crawler. I don't know much about them, and I don't know if anybody else does either, whether they're good or bad. I just know that I wasn't afraid of it, but I had never seen anything like it. And I don't know if I'd want to see it again.
When I was 5 years old, I was lost briefly in the woods. Please know that I know a lot of people have stories like mine. I'm not alone, but I'm also lucky
I know there's stories like mine where it's not just briefly that they're lost, the ones where they remain missing, and it's the stories that their loved ones tell. Now, this was many, many years ago, and my parents are both deceased now, but while alive, they would often tell me this story, including what I told them that day when I was eventually found. There's not much I can remember outside of what I'm about to explain. I was running. I was laughing, surrounded by trees. I was looking at my feet as I ran. And at some point, I saw my feet quickly dash through water, or what seemed like water. It was clear and wavy. I stopped running right away, and I was dry. I turned around to see what it was, and I could see now a wall in front of me, a wall of the same wavy water that I'd just ran through. It didn't appear to be flowing like water, though, just a blanket that made the forest on the other side seem blurry. I didn't see any family, and I couldn't see anyone familiar. I could hear something in the distance. It was my name being called. I thought I should go back the way I came, through the water wall, but I found myself being pulled in the other direction. I felt like someone was physically lifting me, but my feet remained anchored to the ground. My name continued to be called, and I remember calling out as soon as I realized I couldn't move. No one was near me, though. I could see no one. Instead of trying to call out again, I tried to move, and after some effort, I was closer to the wall. And now I could see figures on the other side, blurry figures that resembled people in colorful clothing. And the voices had to be coming from them, and they had to be my family. Then, it's blank. The rest of it filled in by family. The first detail I have trouble coping with is the amount of time that I was apparently gone. I understand a 5-year-old has no concept of time, really, but I was the kid who needed their parents, never away from them for more than a few minutes. So when they told me that I was gone for over an hour, I couldn't believe it. And when they found me, I was just laying in the woods. It looked like I'd passed out, but I had no injuries to my head or anywhere else. My parents, my whole family, and local police, they had all looked in the place that I'd ended up being found. Because of this, my family was under extreme scrutiny by the police. They were under the assumption that one of my family members had harmed me or tried to take me, and had gotten afraid when the police showed up. But as the police continued to question them, it was clear that they were all accounted for, and it was clear that no one who was part of the search was capable of putting me where they found me, not without someone else seeing it too. The whole event was probably far more tragic for everyone else involved, but it does leave me with an unsettling feeling. I'm not claiming to understand what happened to me in the woods, but I know in my heart that I wasn't harmed by any person. I also know that regardless if someone misplaced me, I still remember the water-like wall, my parents and others calling out to me. I still remembered everything up until it went blank. I couldn't help but feel like I was in the same space as everyone, but slightly behind it too. I think another realm goes a little far into the imagination, but it's hard to give an explanation in layman's terms when I don't know of anything like it that exists, simple or complex. Back in 2017, I used to live with my aunt in Minnesota. And while living with her, I had worked at a nearby Walgreens, which was about a 35-40-minute bike ride from her place. This happened on my way home after working the closing shift. Now, being somebody who does believe in paranormal and just bad stuff in general, I was always a little bit nervous making this bike ride at night. But mainly just because my mind would go wild. The route I take home is somewhat isolated. I have to go past a park in a lot of wooded areas. It's barely lit up. There aren't many streetlights or houses. I had just gotten to the park area where it's more naturey and woodsy. I was talking to an ex on the phone. They were currently my girlfriend at the time, as a way to ease my nerves on the way home. I had briefly looked down at my phone when I heard a weird, screeching sound, which caused me to look up. To my horror, there was a large, tall, deathly frail, humanoid creature. It looked very white and pale, almost as if it was sickly. Before I could really get a good look at it, it dropped onto all fours and leapt into the wooded area. Seeing this, I panicked and began to pedal as fast as I could. Meanwhile, I could hear the thing taking chase, but remaining hidden in the woods. I could hear branches constantly snapping, leaves crunching. This thing was in pursuit and out of view. I got about halfway through the route, to the point where nature stops being trees and woods and opens up into rolling hills, sort of flat grasslands. As soon as I got to this point, I heard the thing stop chasing me in complete silence. That's when I noticed a very peculiar scent. Blueberry pie, which really weirded me out because there are no houses, restaurants, or buildings of any kind in this area. So for the scent of a freshly baked blueberry pie, my favorite pie, seemed really sketchy. I paid no attention to it, as to me, it was coming from the distant hills, as if this thing was somehow creating the scent to draw me away from the sidewalk and towards it. So I kept pedaling, and eventually I made it to where the townhomes were, and back home safely, which yes, I did throw my bike into the garage and run inside up to my bedroom like a frightened child. Just turned on the TV and the light. Now, it doesn't end there. Just a few days later, when I started forgetting about the thing that I had seen, I spent the day handing out candy for my aunt on Halloween, and I was watching YouTube until it was time to retire to bed. Shortly after I had gone to my room, I again heard that weird screeching sound. And for some reason, my idiot self decided to check out the window. And there, about 40-50 feet away from the house, standing underneath a few trees, was the creature thingy, which made me quickly just close the window and shut the blinds. The next day, surprisingly, my aunt asked if I had heard the sounds last night and if I had seen the thing as well. From what she'd told me, she'd heard the noises too and wanted to see what was going on. So she took the dog and went into the backyard and had seen the thing standing there. Almost immediately, it dropped to all fours and leapt away. Now, when it comes to this thing's size, I'd say it stands on 2 feet. It's about 7 to 8 feet tall, and I'm 6'5", so it was quite taller than me. It looked very pale, like it was nothing but skin and bones. Yet, it moved incredibly fast, leaping the way that it did, and keeping speed, if not going faster than my bike. If you have any thoughts on what this is, I'm curious. Because other than being terrifying, I have no idea. Being a pretty avid camper, I've seen my fair share of dangerous things in the woods, but nothing I would consider unexplained. All except what I saw more than once while camping in Oregon. It was the same campsite, 2 years in a row. It is, by all accounts, an awesome campsite, and I will intentionally leave their name out because I don't know that this story is exactly encouraging visitors. Usually, regardless of where I am, I'm the last one awake. Camping especially, I really enjoy just stargazing, listening to nature, poking at the fire, eventually putting it out for good. It's nice, and it was nice at this time too, until it sounded like someone put headphones on me, where everything I had been hearing was now muted. But there was something I hadn't heard before. The sound of something moving around slowly in the trees surrounding our tents. I immediately grabbed the flashlight. I started to shine it around, not sure what I expected to see, and suddenly, I could hear again. No longer could I hear footsteps, but instead, nature seemed very loud now. My flashlight met something that I can describe, but I can't explain. Something standing in the trees. Then I realized it was hunched over, not facing me. It appeared to be naked, as in no fur, no clothes, and it looked gray. I was pretty horrified to see that it was very muscular, and its legs bent backwards, like a bird's would. I saw its face only briefly, making out just 2 very large and almost reflective eyes. This was just as it turned towards me in my light, before leaping backwards, retreating further into the woods. I didn't sleep easy this time around, and we left the next day. Not because of this, but man, that was good timing for me, because I couldn't have stayed another night. The next year, we went back to the same campground and campsite. Like I said, great place for many reasons. Per the usual, I stayed up, poking at the fire and reading. It was maybe 2 in the morning when I heard something moving around the trees. Grabbing my flashlight, I shined in the area that I'd heard the noise. I couldn't believe that the same creature was there. It looked exactly the same as I'd remembered from the previous year. Exactly the same, but this time I could see its face, and I could see it standing. It had to be at least 6 feet tall, and the face was very wide. But I had been right about those eyes. They were huge, and even though they essentially were reflecting the light, they were very, very dark, completely black, like a doll's plastic or marble eyes. The legs, the same. I mean, this is a pretty unique looking thing, so I definitely know that it was the same. What was it, though? Still don't have any answers to that, really. I haven't been back to that specific campsite either. Luckily, there's a new place I found that's absolutely incredible. Best of all, no strange, leathery gray giants. Camping is much nicer without them, I must say. I'm a retired wildland firefighter with the National Forest Services, and this is one of my craziest or creepiest things I experienced before I retired. The year is 2004, Hell's Canyon area in the middle of Idaho. My crew and I had been working all day on an emerging incident, and we were going to be working through the night. I was second in charge at the time, so I was ahead of everybody, scouting the area for any problems on an ATV. I had made my way towards a logging road. It was a road that clearly hadn't been used in a long time. As I cruised down the empty road, I could see ahead what looked like a bobcat or lynx, just sitting in the middle of the road. Normally, these things are pretty skittish, so I wasn't sure why it wasn't moving or running away once it could hear me. This thing just stands there for a good 10 seconds, but then it screams at me, and it scampers up into a tree, not 5 feet off the road. I thought this was strange, but not exactly unnerving. About a half-mile down the road, I find a small cabin. Now, I thought this was extra strange. It was federal land, and no private structures should be there. I got off the ATV just to look around, and as I walked the perimeter, I could see that all of the windows and doors had been boarded shut and tight. Yeah, someone had done a good job of securing this place. The door had been replaced by something metal, thick metal, and a giant chain and lock that secured the metal door to the log cabin frame. Someone did not want anything getting in or out of this place. I peered through the remaining space between the hole in the door and the chain that was coming from it. The house was furnished. Furniture in the house, but it had been tossed around. It looked like garbage, papers, practically no light getting through, but enough to see that there were chairs and a table turned over. Something that looked like it could be a couch, but it was too dark. You could see broken glass or a broken mirror on the floor. Something shiny littered the whole ground. I stood there a minute and honestly couldn't make up my mind about this place. I did feel unsettled. So I hopped on the ATV and headed back up the road. And things got a little bit more unsettling. Right where the bobcat had been, there stood an old woman. She was incredibly tan, like she'd been in the sun for years, and she wore a badly tattered nightgown with bare feet, and she was just standing there. I yelled out to her, asking if she needed some help. She didn't say anything, so I almost asked again, but before I could, she screamed at me. I actually felt my knees get weak, grateful that I'd been sitting down at the time of the scream. It was the exact same scream as the cat from before. Then she climbs right up the same tree, and so much faster than any human has the right to be climbing. I didn't stick around. I just headed out fast. I don't even think I had my eyes open as I made my way back down that road. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I tried to unpack it on the way back. By the next morning, after working through the night, I was still unsure of who or what I had seen. So I asked a local guy at the breakfast bar about the cabin, the one off the old logging road. He said he'd never heard of anything like that most folks don't hang out in that area. He then started to ask other patrons at the bar, and sure enough, after asking around a little, a local man hears us talking, and he informs us that I'd seen a skinwalker. He was a tall, very serious Native American man, so originally he actually used a different word, one that escaped my brain, but something I couldn't pronounce anyways. And he translated it to skinwalker, thinking that would be a familiar term for me. But at the time, I didn't really know what that was either. Honestly, to this day, I haven't done a lot of research on it because of what the man said to me. He told me very seriously that I wasn't the first to see the skinwalker, and that I wouldn't be the last. He said I was lucky that I was able to leave unscathed, and that I should never approach or engage with a skinwalker. It's best to not think about it again. I held on to that advice for several years, only ever talking about it with my original crew that weekend. Eventually, I told my wife, but that was 3 years after it had happened. She asked what took me so long to tell her, and I don't know. I guess for a while there, I genuinely feared for our safety, and I thought if she didn't know about it, nothing could affect her. So, I don't really know what I saw, but I know that I saw something that I've never seen since, and that I hope to never see again. Malakoff-Diggins State Park. It's one of those places that you see signs for when you're driving down Highway 20, or the Yuba Donner Scenic Byway in Nevada City, Gold Rush Town. In 2013, myself and a few friends decided to visit Malakoff for a hike on the way back from Reno. No big deal. We hike a lot, and we're used to hot weather, strange terrain, etc. Well, we weren't used to what we experienced while we were in this particular park, and it made for a rather short hike. The park itself was pretty beautiful, and we could see from a map that there was a pond, Diggins Pond. It sat essentially at the center of all the various trail ends. We'd learned that Malakoff was actually part of an abandoned town, a small town that was filled with people that were chasing the gold rush. They'd even settled and had a schoolhouse built. It wasn't much of a town anymore aside from that schoolhouse, but we weren't really there to stay. We just wanted to chase daylight, not in the car, find us a body of water, and then hit the road. My friend, we'll call her Carrie. Carrie and I were a bit ahead of everybody else, and we thought it would be funny to hide behind one of the various large rocks or trees that surrounded the trail. We wanted to scare the others. One of our friends was especially freaked out by the little abandoned town feel, so we knew that we'd get her good. We quieted our steps and found the perfect rock, boulder, and we just waited for our friends to pass. It's easy to realize how long you've been waiting for someone when you're in a crouched position. My thighs were starting to burn, and as Carrie and I looked at each other, it was clear that we were thinking the same thing. What's taking them so long? We slowly stood up and peeked out towards the trail. We couldn't see our friends. They probably got distracted by something shiny. We joked as we walked back in the direction of our friends. When our friends were in view again, we were greeted with a very serious, "There you guys are. What the hell?" And they went on about how that was so creepy and to not do that again. In this moment, Carrie and I were both sort of confused, asking if they thought that we were lost or something, saying that the funny thing was we were originally hiding over there. We'd pointed over the hill towards the rock, but you guys never showed up. Everyone was sort of quiet. And now, we all looked confused. The crying noises, you guys, the crying noises and the voices. Carrie and I looked at each other, then back at everyone else. What voices? We asked this, almost in unison. Everyone gave us that look like, enough is enough, and it became clear that they weren't going to explain themselves. As we stood there in almost silence, I noticed that I had goosebumps. I looked around and everyone else did too, all along our arms and our legs. Maybe we're closer to the water than we thought. I started to say this when I was cut off. Shh. I was shushed by more than one of my friends. And at first, I was offended, but then I heard it. It sounded like crying. It sounded like children crying. We were all so focused and so silent that when something moved just behind us, we all jumped at the same time, trying not to make a sound, but unsuccessfully making a whole lot of it. Suddenly, it felt like something was near us, like watching us. We said to each other out loud that we should head out, but it felt like we couldn't move, like we couldn't leave the way that we'd came in, like something was blocking us from doing that, or maybe it was our instincts telling us that something was over there, something that we didn't want to be a part of. We all sort of made a circle with our bodies, all of our backs facing one another, getting a full view of our surroundings. We could hear the sound of something heavy walking on the trail, but none of us could see anyone walking. We asked each other over and over, looking from trail end to trail end, but there was no one there, no one but us. I squeezed my friends' hands and I told them quietly that I thought something was getting closer. My friends nodded. No one else said anything for a while. It was clear now that the sound was much closer, practically in our bubble. But there's no one here or there, so what? It was Carrie that led the charge, declaring, "Whatever, let's go. This shit is too weird." And she took off running, so we followed suit. We hadn't gotten far when suddenly my friend yelled out, like she'd gotten hurt. So we all halted and turned back. She was on the ground. "Holy shit, you're bleeding." I know it's not exactly the best thing to say to someone who's injured, but I was yelling this as I reached for a towel and my first aid kit. But my friend said she was fine. She told me not to bother with the kit, that we just needed to get back to the car. I wasn't feeling right about just leaving her bleeding, but she was already up and going. So, again, I followed. Almost as soon as the car doors closed, my friend, the one that was hurt, started crying. But it was like, as soon as we went to comfort her, she snapped out of it and told us to start driving. So Carrie started to drive, and we sat in silence for a minute, pretty sure we were just decompressing. Something grabbed me. Something grabbed me and pulled me backwards. That's why I'm bleeding. Like, I didn't trip, you guys. I hate that place. At first, I didn't know what to think, but then it was like, oh yeah, we experienced something super weird before that happened. We were running because we knew something bad was there. You guys believe me, right? Like, what was that? My friend finally asked. Of course we believe you. I mean, I heard the crying, and that definitely wasn't me or Carrie. If that's the same crying that you guys heard, it wasn't us. The conversation after I said that just sort of spiraled, and we all recapped the nonsense we'd just experienced. Eventually, we'd been driving and talking about the weirdness so long that we didn't even notice that one of our friends hadn't said anything for quite some time. That's when we all learned together that Malakoff Diggins State Park has a bit of a dark past. We found several stories on the place, different variations of what really broke the town, but one story that continued to pop up. It was a dark one, the story of a school teacher who had murdered one of his students. But he hadn't just murdered a student. He'd murdered the child by hanging him from the rafters of the schoolhouse in front of the rest of the children. Yeah, it was one of the darker things I'd heard in a while. I mean, just know this, we aren't adrenaline junkies. We don't go to places with the intention of getting scared or anything like that. Had we known the dark history, we likely would have picked a different hike. It just sort of shook all of us, especially my friend who was grabbed. But it's been hard for all of us to grasp or conceptualize the idea that spirits or some unknown energy can actually hurt you. I mean, that just doesn't seem like it should be something that is possible. Yet here we are, talking about that time that it happened. Well, that's the only creepy experience I've ever had, but it's enough for me. We definitely always at least research the trails and parks that we go to now. We don't need a repeat of that one summer, we always say. We'll do anything to never have to hear the sound of children crying in the woods again.
I was recently discussing ghosts and sharing ghost stories with my best friend, and remembered this strange experience I'd had during outdoor education camp in 6th grade. I realized I hadn't thought about it for many years and decided to write about it here, because to this day, I have no idea what I actually saw, and it still gives me the creeps. My best friend had also been there at the time, but I'd been too afraid to tell her about what I'd seen, in case I was just crazy. We're now both in our early 30s. It was 2001, and the whole 6th grade class, so about 60 kids, had a week-long camping field trip in some redwoods, a couple of hours from our school. It was supposed to be a celebration for finishing elementary school, basically a week of swimming, hiking, crafts, and adventure. It was great fun. On one of the last nights, the camp aides took us on a night hike into the forest. There were about 5 to 10 camp counselors and teachers with flashlights, and the students got little glow sticks to hold. We first gathered in a large soccer field to get directions and organize our group. It was very dark, and we could see all of the stars in the sky. We were surrounded by thick, dark forest. As I marveled at the nature around me, I saw something white flittering about in my peripheral vision. I turned to see a strange, rapidly shifting, white entity. It seemed like it was glitching, the way that it was sort of blinking in and out of existence. It was almost pitch black outside, yet the figure seemed to be internally lit, with sparks of energy. Thinking it was my eyes adjusting to the dark, seeing floaters or ocular debris, I rubbed my eyes and blinked. I looked straight at it, expecting it to disappear, but it didn't. It actually seemed to become aware of me looking at it, as it moved back into the trees a little further, as I continued to watch it move about. When I looked away, I could still see it in the corner of my eye, starting to come closer. It emerged from the perimeter of the forest. At first, it looked like a humanoid, diaphanous figure. Then, it morphed into a wolf-like figure, running on all fours quickly. There was a good distance between me and this spirit, but I was still scared, and I felt sick to my stomach. I thought I was going crazy or something was wrong with my eyes. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I'd only had a couple of spooky encounters like cabinet slamming. Up until this moment, I'd always felt there was a logical explanation to everything. Anyways, we finally began our hike. My best friend was right next to me, but I told her nothing of this creepy-ass, shifting, transparent creature thing in the forest. The thought of her not being able to see it, or thinking that I was crazy, that was too much of a risk. To my relief, we turned away from the side of the forest where the thing was, and we start to enter the forest on the opposite side. The trail was very steep. We hiked in a long line, with the camp aides at the front, middle, and end of the group. I was somewhere in the middle. After 15 minutes or so of hiking, I remember feeling a prickly sensation down my spine, and my stomach churned. I glanced behind me, and that's when I see the forest thing at the very back of the line, following us, or me. Although there were still a lot of kids in the line separating me and the thing, it was much closer than before when it was in the woods by the field. It now had a distinctly humanoid form, although its edges seemed blurry and in still constant flux. It had no face, and if I stared at it directly, it would fade somewhat, but not disappear. And like before, when looking at it peripherally, it became much more solid in form. I was scared shitless, but still said nothing to anyone. I decided my eyes were still tricking me. Once we got to the top of our destination, it was time to turn around. I saw the figure still hanging at the end of the line. Then, the front of the line doubled back, and to my horror, I realized I would be forced to pass the white figure. As soon as I got within 15 or 20 feet of the figure, it dissipated, like steam or smoke, right in front of me. I never saw it again. I didn't sleep that night in the open-air cabins, and I was very relieved that we were going home the next day. Normally, people talk about Skinwalker Ranch like madmen, so I never really believed them until this experience a few years back. My family owns land close to/on the ranch, and one day, me and my cousins decided to explore a bit, but quickly ran back. We thought we'd saw a coyote, and that it had started to chase us. Holy shit, we ran, fearing for our lives, not looking behind us. As we were getting ready to sleep, our parents asked us why we upset the Indians. They told us that there was a man not far behind us as we were running. I went outside and saw that where we ran, there were several footsteps that stayed on the same path, same track, same distance. But the pattern was different. It changed. There was one set that changed from paws to duck feet, then human. Then it looked like frog feet, but bigger. And it looked like it was on all fours, and then human feet again. We stayed there 2 more nights, and by mine and 2 of our cousins' rooms, the thing came back. At least that's what I told myself. Everyone thought that it was something different. Late into the night, I heard scratching outside my room. I was the only one awake, so I looked out the window to meet a pair of pure baby blue eyes. I woke up my cousins and told them, and we decided, since there was no way I was going to sleep, we would just play video games until dawn. In the morning, I packed my stuff and sat in the car. As we were driving off, we saw some big, at least 2-foot scratches by my window. Never going back there. Never explore the ranch Never. For my college screenwriting class, we were split into groups of 4 students each for a group project. The assignment was to select a myth or legend to base a 10 to 15 page screenplay on. My group thought it would be interesting to choose a cryptid for the project, rather than a well-known historical myth or legend. Our teacher cleared us for the idea, and we started brainstorming. Of course, we didn't want to do the most well-known cryptids like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot, so we started looking up lesser-known ones. One of the ones that somebody pitched was known as the knot deer, also known as the night deer in some cases. According to people's stories, it looked almost exactly like a large deer, but something felt horribly off. It was only when they drove away that they realized what was specifically wrong about it. Still, even before they understood exactly what was going on, every story mentioned the overwhelming sense of wrongness. To quote someone else's personal account, "It was a deer in the way that a graveyard is a playground. You can treat it as such, I guess, but it won't feel the same." Lo and behold, after a bit of research, I found that it was located in North Carolina. Not only that, but it was just over an hour away. Just about every written or publicized story of the knot deer supposedly took place in Boone, North Carolina, and its surrounding areas. I informed the group of what I discovered, and being as spontaneous as I am, told them that I'd be driving out to the location that very night. I figured I probably wouldn't come across anything, even though I was legitimately curious. At the very least, it was something interesting to do, and I'd be able to accurately describe the location and ambiance of the area to the main screenwriter. I wasn't able to convince the other 3 members of the group to go with me. They all had their legitimate reasons. And since I made the decision to go so suddenly, I understood why none of them wanted to go with me on the trip. Still, I had nothing else to do that night, and I'd been itching for more travel ever since the entire pandemic started. I filled my roommate in on everything and asked if he wanted to go with me. At first, he told me that he would just consider it, but as I was getting ready to go, he told me that he decided to tag along. One of his main reasons for doing so was that he felt like he had to go with me. I shrugged it off, not thinking much of what he said. After filling up my car with some extra gas and buying a couple of snacks for the road, I plugged Boone, North Carolina into my GPS and headed out. My roommate and I were pretty relaxed for the majority of the ride there. We joked around, listened to all sorts of music through the radio and CD player, and had some of whatever snacks we'd brought earlier. Eventually, we got close to Boone. That's when we started to feel like something was off. It wasn't a feeling strong enough to make us turn around, but it was worth mentioning to each other. When we got into the city, it was just about what we had imagined. Gas stations, car dealerships, dollar stores, and small cafes. All of them were closed at that time, with the time of arrival in Boone being around 9-10 p.m. But all of them were well lit and unintimidating. My roommate told me that we should probably head back around 9:30, and that he'd let me know when that time came around. I agreed with him since I didn't want to spend too long searching for an experience. Needless to say, when we didn't come across anything by 9:30, he decided to let us keep going for another half hour. The clock in my car's dash had been broken for a while now, and I couldn't look at my phone while I was driving, so I was totally reliant on him for the time. Had I known that we were going to be driving in the area past 9:30, I probably would have mentioned it and turned around sooner. Had I done that, I would have completely missed the experience we ended up having. I'm still unsure whether or not that would have been a good thing. We ended up in Tennessee by 9:50. That's when things started to get bad. At this point, we rarely came across any other cars on the highway. We took the first exit we saw and ended up driving along more mountainous, forested roads. This meant that there were lots of tall, dark trees and almost no streetlights, twisting roads that forced you to slow down. My roommate said that he started to feel bad about the whole situation, and I agreed wholeheartedly. Still, there was nowhere to turn, so we continued going straight since that was really the only option for the time being. A few different times we got a serious sense of dread, but usually that feeling disappeared by the time we got onto the next section of the road. There were a couple of times that the both of us had started to tear up, not because we were sad or upset, but because it felt so wrong to be there, like it was somewhere we weren't supposed to be. The feeling of dread was very particular, too. It wasn't feeling bad in the sense of depression or anxiety. The best way to describe it is a sense of wrongness. It seemed to come in waves, not sticking around for a long time, but not going away entirely either. By this point, my GPS had stopped working entirely. Both my roommate's phone and my phone said they had full bars, but mine simply refused to connect to anything. Luckily, his GPS was still working fine, so he plugged in the directions for home. It continued taking us down that road for a while longer. The area started to become much more forested as we went on, and the road started to twist and turn much more than it had before. Basically, we had come across the exact area where you'd expect a monster to be, and we started to feel really, really bad. I don't think I can express the feeling well enough with words, but it was the worst we had felt so far. We knew something wasn't right. We both felt like we weren't supposed to be there. We felt like we needed to get out. Since my roommate started getting truly spooked, that put me on edge even more, since he never gets scared of anything. There wasn't much we could do about it, though. The GPS still wanted us to follow the road, so we both awaited its next directions, eager to get on the highway back home. The sense of dread still came and went with every other segment of road we crossed. Eventually, the GPS wanted us to turn. My roommate told me to turn right on that road. I knew he meant to turn right onto the road and follow it straight ahead, but for some reason, I figured we should just turn around and backtrack. I started slowing down, and we both started to feel seriously bad. Like things were very wrong and something was about to happen bad. It was the worst we had felt along the entire trip so far. My roommate said my eyes were glazed over as I kept saying something along the lines of, "I just need to turn around right here. I just need to turn around right here," over and over. The more I said it, the quieter I got, until I was almost at a whisper. Keep in mind that I am normally a fairly loud person, and I had been loud the entire drive up until this point. I pulled off onto a gravel dip on the side of the road. Along the gravel dip was a thin chicken wire fence, shiny and silver. Back on the road behind us was a wall of dirt and rock. We were surrounded by tall, dark trees that blocked most of the night sky. Even with the headlights on, it was difficult to see very far ahead. My roommate said, very forcefully, that we couldn't stop and that we needed to keep going because he felt seriously bad. But I wasn't listening to him. I wasn't quite processing what he was saying. And for some reason, I was having a difficult time hearing him at all. After he realized he wasn't getting through to me, He broke into a literal shout and told me that we had to get out of there because we could not stop and we could not go back that way. It took him using his road rage yell to snap me out of it and get me to speed down the road. The only word I can use to describe what I felt in that moment was absolute terror. Even as I was slowing down, I felt it get worse and worse until it was almost overwhelming. I only realized that after we'd gotten out of the area and back onto the highway. As we passed through the area and started getting into the city again, the looming sense of dread started to fade away. By the time we got back onto the main highway, we felt safe again. But in the moment that I pulled off onto the gravel dip on the road, where I had almost stopped the car entirely, that was the most terrifying experience I've ever had in my life. I would bet my life savings that had we turned around, we would have seen something we never wanted to. Both of us admitted to tearing up as we drove off from the spot. I was much more shaken up than my roommate was, and it took me a little while to fully process what had actually happened. I think it's safe to say, even though I didn't explicitly see anything for myself, I found exactly what I was looking for. During my sophomore year of high school, so 2000, I had one of those unexplained experiences. I mean, I can explain what I heard, even what I felt, but that still doesn't fully explain what happened. Lucky for me, I wasn't alone. I was with two of my friends, and a random civilian would cross paths with us, just as we experienced this event. So what I'm saying is that I'm not crazy, and if I am, then so are the other 3 people that were in the woods that day. My friends and I would often hang out in the woods. They were just behind the school. The woods led to more woods, basically leading to more woods. So no houses, just trees and a couple of creeks. A lot of nothing, which is exactly what teens are looking for. Well, right before summer, they closed off the entrance to these woods from the school. It was the only entrance we'd really ever used, so we explored new ways to get into the woods. And without officially trespassing, we'd found what we assumed was an entrance into the woods. Upon entering, one of my friends asked if we should drop crumbs or something so we didn't get lost. We laughed at the time, not thinking he was serious. In fact, he wasn't serious. So we just walked through and onward. After about 5 or 6 minutes of walking, I looked at my watch and asked my friends if we should stop, smoke a cigarette, and maybe just smoke a joint where we were, as it seemed like we'd gone far enough into the woods. They didn't agree, though. So again, onward we went. It was probably 15 minutes into following my friends that I asked them to wait up. Suddenly I felt sorta dizzy. We hadn't smoked any weed yet, so I assumed it was the cigarette I'd decided to light up. But then I heard something strange. Crying. It was in the distance, possibly ahead of us, maybe behind us. I stopped in my tracks and thought that I was losing it. Then, both of my friends turned around, looking about as unsettled as I was feeling inside. We stood in silence about 5 to 10 feet apart from each other. The crying continued. It sounded like a woman, but yet there was some sort of distortion to the cry, and it made it incredibly uncomfortable. We decided, let's book it back the way we came. Both of my friends headed towards me, and we started to hustle back towards the random entrance we'd found less than 20 minutes ago. But it was strange, the crying. As we ran, it was like the crying didn't get closer to us, and it didn't get further away either. Just surrounded us, like we'd been wearing headphones listening to this twisted crying. After hustling for a minute, suddenly I stopped as I saw someone appear from behind a tree. They were as surprised as I was and let out a small shriek. Then we both, or all of us, exhaled. The woman said that she'd heard crying, that it sounded like a small child in distress. We told her that we heard the crying too, but that it didn't sound like a child. And we told her that we were running from the crying. Then we all just stood there and listened. There was no more crying. Instead, we each heard one long, loud scream, followed by the largest gust of wind I've ever felt in my life. So much force behind this gust that it almost took all 4 of us off our feet. Immediately after that, we all took off, back towards the entrance, and eventually we made our way out to the sidewalk. I remember leaving there feeling very uneasy. While walking home, we hardly said a word to one another. We were so spooked by the whole event that we didn't even end up getting high. In retrospect, I'm sort of glad about that part because I probably wouldn't have been able to definitively say what I heard and what I felt. Not 100% anyway. But I can assure you, 100%, something not so pleasant was in the woods that day. For those of you wondering, I personally never went back into the woods, so it's possible people continue to hear stuff, and it's possible that they don't. I don't recommend it, though. It leaves you with a feeling. It's not a great one, and that may be putting it a little lightly. Now, whether you actually believe in the paranormal or just enjoy reading spooky stories in an attempt to scare yourself, this is one of the many paranormal experiences I've had, arguably the most terrifying, converting one of the eyewitnesses from a skeptic to completely believing in the paranormal and actually taking it seriously. My friends and I have always been quite fond of doing urbex exploring. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's when you go out and look for abandoned and derelict buildings to explore and photograph. We didn't go out searching for the haunted side of things. We just enjoyed the eeriness and also the beauty of old abandoned places. Living in Scotland, a lot of these abandoned places are normally surrounded by amazing scenery, from hills and mountains to thick forests and lush fields. So we'd always make a day out of it when we'd go exploring. One house in particular was our favorite, so much so that we had already visited a couple of times prior to this experience. Myself and 2 of my best friends, who we'll call C and B, decided to go back, but the condition of the place had declined quite rapidly since the last time we'd been there, and everything seemed very unstable, but we didn't let that stop us. Finding that our usual entry spot had been boarded up, we felt quite defeated, but decided to look for another entryway. After searching around for a while, We noticed that the roof on one of the lower parts of the house had been damaged by fire and was practically all gone. It wasn't the easiest to get up to, using a tree and each other to do so, but we finally got in. It was going relatively normal. We were wandering around the inside, searching and admiring the rooms that we could still get into, being terrified by the occasional bird, being spooked by our footsteps, and taking photos of the amazing architecture. However, something was different this time. The whole place felt off, and a little more eerie than it normally did. I've always been what you would describe as spiritually inclined, so I felt this more than my friends did. One of them was a complete skeptic, so he just brushed it off and said that we were over-exaggerating and making things up. His mind was going to be completely changed after leaving this house. After exploring the top 3 floors as much as we could, cringing at the spray paint art the vandals had left, we were on the ground floor, just having a chat and discussing how much the house's condition had really declined. We were standing in one of the hallways, almost in a triangle formation. I was standing in a door frame with my back towards the empty room, with C to my left and B to my right. I was still feeling a little uneasy, but I didn't give much thought to it. As we were all conversing about the plans for the rest of the day, I felt something on my back. It felt like someone had run their hand down my back. From the base of my neck to the center of my back, I felt a firm, consistent pressure until the pressure tapered off down to the base of my back. It was over within seconds. I felt all the color drain from my face as I frantically jumped forward with a scream. B and C both looked at me in confusion and asked what happened and if I had hurt myself. In a haze of confusion and dizziness, I wasn't able to form any words. Never mind describing what I had just felt. I regained my bearings and took a couple of deep breaths before trying my best to explain the sensation of being touched. B's face turned a little pale as she saw how serious I was being. However, C was a skeptic. He laughed and thought I was joking, or that I'd accidentally hit something without realizing, or a bug had hit me. I knew that wasn't the case, because for a split second, before it happened, I felt every single hair on my body stand up as a warning to what was about to happen. Being slightly freaked out, B and myself managed to convince C that it was time to leave. On top of what had just happened, it was also getting a little cold. While making our way to the same section that we'd entered through, I started to feel a burning sensation run down my back, like someone had taken hot coals or a flame down my back. Starting to freak out again, I asked B to check if anything was there, asking her what was wrong. I automatically knew something was wrong because she didn't give me a response. She was just silent. Next thing I knew, B was calling over C to come and look, which made my anxiety spike up more. From the look on C's face, I became increasingly worried. They both nervously told me that there were marks going down my back. Obviously not being able to see my back myself, I asked them to take a picture for me to see. Looking at the photo, there were 3 distinctive scratches going down my back, exactly where I'd felt something or someone touching me. At first, C was convinced that I'd done it to myself or caught myself on something, but after examining the scratches more, he determined that that couldn't have been. The scratches went under my bra strap, which would have been impossible for me to do without them noticing. At this point, we were all trying to keep calm while internally freaking out. We tried to make our way out as quick as we could without injuring ourselves.
Climbing back over the wall of the house and through the hole where the roof used to be, we collectively walked a few feet away from the house and stopped to look back at it. Still trying to understand what had just happened, we all agreed that we'd go back to the car and never come back here. The walk back to the car, which took around 20 minutes, was relatively uneventful. Apart from a continuous uneasy feeling that we were being watched or followed and occasionally thinking we could hear footsteps behind us, it was actually quite peaceful, taking in the Scottish countryside. We got to the car, where we sat and had a smoke, still trying to completely calm ourselves down. It's safe to say that after that day, C took a lot of time to process the events, but undoubtedly became a believer. We swore to never come back to this house, but for some reason, we're always drawn back to it. It's like an urge to come back and visit, like an itch that you can't quite scratch. Maybe we're just drawn in by the eeriness or the mystery around that day, or maybe it's something more than that. So let's all be honest here. Everyone knows that the rake is nothing more than a creepypasta. However, you cannot deny that people around the world are seeing and having legitimate experiences with this creature, or rather one that resembles the being in the stories, myself included. I've grown up with a relatively open mind in regards to strange phenomena and things that aren't generally accepted by mainstream science or society, but always approach things with appropriate skepticism, too. I have spent a very large majority of my life in the woods, hunting, fishing, and mountain climbing, miles deep in the backcountry. And so, within all of that time, I've observed many different animals, plants, and sometimes things I just simply cannot explain. I've gone camping and trekking solo many times in my life. It was liberating to just pack whatever you needed to survive and go miles deep into the backcountry where animals aren't even afraid of you, simply because they aren't familiar with humans. It felt so special to be the only one immersed in that environment, but not anymore. Now, hidden behind all of the natural beauty is underlying anxiety, fear, and legitimate danger. An environment that once felt so comforting and therapeutic turned into one that drove me absolutely mad with questions and uncertainties, and is now one I will not enter alone, for I know what is possible and what is truly roaming around the forests of Northern America. It was 2016, in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, that I saw a creature that forever changed my life and the way I perceive the world we live in. The first time I had ever heard of the creature, dubbed the Rake, was during a conversation with a friend who had lived in the area for years and had encountered this creature on multiple occasions in very close proximity to his house. I remember him asking me if I had ever seen anything strange in the large plot of woods across the street from his house, which at the time I had not. However, long before it was brought up, I always had a deep feeling in my chest about this plot of woods. I didn't know what it was. I just knew that it carried a very heavy, dark energy that was strong enough to encourage you to stay out. My friend took out their phone and showed me a picture of the rake. It comes up with any Google search, a very generic picture. I laughed it off, and he warned me about the creature because I genuinely thought he was just growing marijuana or something in the woods, and he didn't want me to find it. I couldn't have been more wrong. months had passed, with little more than strange noises at night and the sound of some cats being carried off into the dark, until the day that changed my life happened. It was midnight. A rainstorm had just dumped a bunch of rain. Me and a coworker at the time had just clocked out and were heading to the friend's house who had warned me originally about the creature. His house is on a long straight road with a dead end. Very few houses on one side, woods on the other. As we're heading down the road with high beams on, my coworker slams on the brakes and starts freaking out, saying that he had just saw the creature kneeling down on the shoulder of the road. Instantly, without thought, I jumped out of the car and immediately heard running and crashing through the woods in a parallel line to the road. Thankfully, due to the hard braking, the car shifted slightly so that the high beams were pointed into the woods, and that's when I saw it. That's when my life changed, my beliefs shattered, and my reality turned upside down. A 6-foot-tall, naked creature with grayish-white skin and long arms ran through the section of the woods fully illuminated by the headlights, giving me at least 15 seconds of uninterrupted visual contact with the creature, firmly imprinting it into my head. It ran just like a human being, however, was incredibly fast and jumping over any obstacle in the way until it reached the point where the headlights no longer illuminated the woods. It then pretended to jump and run deeper into the woods. However, it actually turned and headed back to the road, where I lost sight of it in the dark part of the woods for about 30 seconds. As I was standing in the middle of the road, absolutely dumbfounded, with my jaw to the floor, trying to comprehend the severity of the situation, it then crawled out from the woods and crossed the road on all fours, about 60 yards away from me, and disappeared into the woods on the other side. I've been tormented by the creature since. It makes me confused, sad, curious. I can't get the image out of my head. I can't forget the feeling this creature gave me while I lived there, playing and toying with my head in waking life and in my dreams. I don't go into the backcountry alone anymore. I can't enjoy the solitude without anxiety ruining it. I can't be free. This creature exists, and so do others, that we just can't understand. And it's important that people realize this so they can enjoy nature while also being safe. I'm not sure how this post will be taken. I'm not really sure why I felt like now was the time to come out about my story. But it's eating me alive. It's given me crippling anxiety, and I have to do something to try to get this off my chest. Believe me or don't, that doesn't matter to me. I just want people to be safe, and I want my freedom back. And if coming out about this will help, then I'll do anything. The world truly isn't all that it seems.
I'm going to do my best in retelling the story that my grandfather's told me a few times. In the 1970s, he lived near Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he did a lot of nighttime fishing on Lake Michigan in his wooden canoe that he owned at the time, given to him by his grandfather. It was going to be mine, but during this story, my grandfather gave a pretty straightforward reason why he doesn't have it to pass on to me. Not that I honestly needed a wooden canoe that I'd never used taking up space in my apartment. I'd be forced to choose between having a bed and a canoe in my apartment, so thanks, Grandpa. But I've digressed from the actual story and how it happened, so it's 1970. My grandfather is doing his thing on his wooden canoe, fishing at night with a net, some live bait he handpicked out of my great-grandma's garden, and his rusty homemade pole. Apparently this part of the lake was one of the most peaceful places to be during his youth. His secret nook, he called it. It's a crystal clear night, quiet, with the moon's reflection illuminating the lake. He's been on the lake for roughly an hour or two, and he's already caught 3 fish, 4 if you count the one he tossed back. As my grandfather patiently waits for another bite, he sees what he describes as an upside-down cereal bowl-looking object, bobbing in the water a couple yards away from the canoe. He says he sat there and stared at it for a good 2 minutes, wondering if it was an animal by the way that it was remaining in place, rather than drifting with the small waves of the canoe. Then, he said this thing bobbed up a little bit more, and it looked like the crown of a head emerging. I asked if it was a dead body, and he said wait, because he thought that too, and rowing closer, it did look more and more like a woman's head. Each wave gave more certainty to this as it tousled the hair, revealing visible facial features down to the bridge of the nose. It's pale, and the skin is leathery from being in the water. This turns his stomach into knots, but almost in shock and denial at what he's seeing, my grandfather takes his oar and gently taps it, and its fucking eyes opened. Not only do the eyes open, it shoots back down into the lake under his canoe. Terrified beyond belief, he almost falls out of the canoe while jolting back and loses the oar. But you better believe he used the other remaining oar, like he was part of a one-man crew team. Crossing the lake so fast, he crushes the canoe on the rock edge and abandons it to climb out, completely negating the grass slope that he used to get in, which was too far in the other direction on the lake. Lost his pole and the 3 fish he caught as well. After he climbed to the rock ledge, he turned back and looked out. It was once again still and quiet. This scared him more because he didn't know if what he saw also exited the lake when he did. Was it amphibious? What was it? It was scary, and none of these questions or answers were things that my grandfather really wanted to discover alone in the dark. So he ran, and he left the family heirloom that was going to be passed down to me to sink into the depths of Lake Michigan. My great-grandma also accused him of doing drugs and kicked him out of the house when he had to explain the canoe. He ended up being homeless for about 3 years. And that's when he said he experienced something worse. This was after being homeless for 2 years, he says. He set up camp in some woods just outside my great-grandparents' house. He was laying in his tent, not sleeping, just laying. Suddenly he hears some rustling outside of his tent. So he hops up, he grabs his hatchet, and just as he's about to unzip the tent, he hears movement inside the tent. He whips himself around, and there's a face. Not a person, just a face. He says it's essentially coming through the back of his tent, but not just the imprint of a face, the actual face. He's initially so shocked that he doesn't even swing the hatchet. Instead, he observes what he's seeing the best he can, and he tries to reason with himself. The wet hair covering the face, the pale leathered skin. It was the face from the lake. Before he can recall the hatchet, the face makes an immediate dash for my grandfather. He finds himself thrown back slightly, not feeling pain but coldness and fear. He sees no face around him any longer, but he closes his eyes and swings the hatchet wildly now. By the end of all that, He had nothing more to show for it than a few giant holes in his tent. I asked him, "Were you dreaming?" And I'm told again, "Wait." He tells me that it wasn't a dream, that after that he couldn't even sleep. But after a while, he got restless and went outside the tent to check around. Toward the back of the tent, the dirt was no longer dirt. It was mud, as if water or something wet had just been there. Shortly afterwards, he heard the sound of something large plopping in the water. But when he looked at the lake, it looked like glass. No ripples, no movement. This kick-started my grandfather's plan to not live in the woods anymore. And he told me quite frankly, it made him pretty sure he didn't want to live anywhere near Lake Michigan. Back in 2016, my friends and I, for the longest time, had been itching to go camping at our local campsite. It was in Los Padres National Park in Southern California. When we found the perfect weekend to go, one that didn't interfere with any of our work schedules, we set the date. 3 days before the trip, we found out that we were going to get hit by the El Niño rainstorm. Us, being the types of dudes that we are, didn't care if we got hit by this storm while camping. So we packed up our cars and made the 45-minute drive to the campsite. The campsite was a family-friendly one, with about 100 camping lots that circled around the clearing in the forest. We found the perfect spot underneath a huge thick of trees that would help block as much rain as possible, and it helped out that the restrooms were only 30 yards away. As soon as we got to our spot, we took advantage of the afternoon sky being clear for the moment, and we rushed to set up our tents. The layout that we made was that we pitched our tents close to one another, where our tent doors were only 6 feet apart. The reason why we did this is because in order to combat the rain, I bought a 30-foot by 30-foot thick blue canopy tarp that I threw over and under our tents to cover us from the rain above, but also from the rain that would be running through the ground. It was a genius move on my part, but whenever you would walk around our tent, you would be making so much noise from crunching the plastic tarp. Hours passed and we were all around the campfire. It was late into the evening, and this was the first time that I noticed that there were barely any other campers. They were mainly camping in their RVs like the fake campers they were. In my honest opinion, they were the smart ones. Unlike my friends and I that were sleeping in 2 small tents, with our only protection being the blue tarp. I was getting tired from the long day's work, and I decided I was going to go conk out. My friends followed my lead as well. The sleeping arrangements were that I had my friend Ray sleeping in my tent, and AJ and S were sleeping in theirs. Before I called it a night, I whispered to Ray and I told him, "I'm going to prank call S and AJ, but I'm not going to say anything." Ray smiled as I dialed my friends up. I called them unrestricted, and S's phone started to ring. Both of them, being the way they are, got timid very easily, and they said to one another, "Who's calling you this late at night?" "I don't know. They called me unrestricted. Are you going to answer?" "Of course not." Ray and I were holding in our laughter as they ignored our call. I decided to do it one more time. Once their phone started to ring, they started to freak out once again, and they said, "Who is it this time?" "Same person, I think. I'm going to answer." As they did answer, S said in a very shaky tone, "Hello?" Ray and I had to hold in our laughter as we kept as quiet as possible, not wanting to make any noises that would give off that it was us. I held the phone close to my mouth as I began to breathe heavily in a murderous way. I ended the call, and just hearing them freak out the way they did was making my night even more fun. Me, being the idiot that I am, called them one more time, and this time, S picked up the phone immediately and said in a tough voice, Look, whoever this is better stop. I'm about to call the cops if you keep on calling. This is not a threat. Ray and I looked at one another as we, at the same time, began to fake moan so loud and immediately started to bawl out in laughter. AJ and S were so mad at us for pulling this prank on them. They were cursing us out. Me, finally calming down from laughing so loudly, told the boys, "Good night, I'll have pancakes ready in the morning." Since I fell asleep relatively easily, I was out in a matter of minutes, while Ray, AJ, and S were up for a while longer. I was the first of my friends to wake up in the morning, and as I promised, I had the pancakes already cooking by the time everybody else woke up. The smell of me cooking woke up my friends one by one. They got out of their tents, and as we were eating, AJ spoke up and said, "Hey, Jay, the prank you pulled last night went a little too far. Yeah, you had us ready to run to our car and take off." Me, feeling a bit guilty, apologized and said, "Sorry guys, my bad." Yeah, it's one thing to prank call us like that, but then to walk around our tent and then to go inside of it in the middle of the night, that's just totally off limits, S said. Me, not knowing what they were talking about, said, "What do you guys mean?" "Come on, still with the jokes. You were the one that was walking around our tent and you walked in." Ray spoke up and said, "That wasn't Jay who was walking around. I thought that was you two getting your revenge on us for scaring you." "That wasn't us doing that. It was you two." So, to explain, after I fell asleep, about an hour had passed where Ray, S, and AJ were still up, and all was quiet in the forest until the sounds of footsteps were heard, stepping on our blue tarp that was on the ground. At first, my friends thought that it could have been just a forest animal wandering, but the heavy footsteps were a dead giveaway that it was a person, as they described. The person was walking around their tents, all of them, making constant figure eights. The person would place their fingers on the tent's fabric walls to run them up and down. The footsteps finally stopped after a couple of minutes, right in between our tent doors. The three of them were already having their hearts pounding out of their chest. It was silent for a long minute until the sound of the tent zipper being slid open was heard. As AJ says, the tent's door was only opened halfway, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. But in the darkness, both S and AJ saw the silhouette of a man's face pop his head into the tent to look at both of them. AJ and S faked being asleep the entire time, but they kept their eyes locked on the man. The man then opened the tent fully and walked inside the tent, just standing at the entrance. The man didn't say a word or do anything, just watched the both of them, laying in their sleeping bags. After their longest minute ever, the man just took his steps out of the tent, and his footsteps were heard walking away, disappearing into the night. The entire time that this was happening, S and AJ thought that it was either me or Ray doing this, and Ray thought that it was AJ or S doing this. Back to us arguing back and forth at the breakfast table. We were interrupted by a man walking through our campsite, and he said, "Good morning, boys. How did the four of you sleep last night?" This man spoke with a smoker's voice, as if he'd been doing that for all of his 45 years of being alive. He wore a dirty, sweat-stained white t-shirt that looked more gray at this point, and his blue jeans looked as if they'd never been taken off of his body. He smelt like liquor, not a good sign at 8 in the morning, and his words were just mumbling around. We didn't say a word to this guy as he then asked us if we had any cigarettes to spare him. I said that we didn't smoke, and he said, "Oh well, you boys want to visit me in my RV? Just stop by anytime." The man continued to walk away, towards the restrooms, and as he was done using it, he walked back to our campsite. He didn't say anything this time, But he looked at us and gave us a nearly toothless smile, and he walked back to his RV. I took note of his RV, as it was the only RV that stuck out as being dirty and more run down than the others. We quickly summed up the man as the person who was walking around our tents last night, and S and AJ now remembered that they smelt liquor from the person who was standing in their tent. We all agreed that we would keep an extra eye out on this guy, and if he did spend another night, we would most likely report him to the park rangers if he tried anything else. Well, it was around lunchtime now, and the man came back. Not to use the restroom, but just to talk to us. So any of you boys interested in buying an RV? Y'all can go check it out right now, see if you want to buy it. I don't need it anymore since my wife left me. Just check out the inside of the RV. No, we are good, sir, I said with a visible, threatening tone. The man seemed to notice this, and he walked away. The man did end up leaving a few hours before sunset, but the entire time that he was there, he kept glancing at us. The man had his RV about 50 yards away from us, and I noticed that he had a restroom right next to his RV. Why did he make an effort of walking all the way over to our campsite to use our restroom? Also, why did he even use ours if RVs come with restrooms installed in them? Whatever the man wanted, we were just glad that we were about to enjoy the rest of our weekend. I've been seeing something around that I don't really know what it is. I'm going to preface this by saying it isn't exactly humanoid. It just talks like one. I first saw it when I had a girl over, and she wanted to look out my window at the stars around 4 a.m. So I turned off my LEDs and I opened the curtains, and a deer was out in the road. It looked like a normal deer, until it stood up on its hind legs. It had blood on its underbelly, and it stood like that for several minutes, until we looked away and it was gone. I'm not in skinwalker territory. I've done a lot of research on them to try to figure this out. Of course, that's not my only encounter, though. The next one takes place at a park around 9 p.m. with two of my friends. We had just called my friend's mom to pick us up, and 30 seconds later, we heard her little sister say, "Jess." But when we looked up, nobody was there. We all heard it, and we stood up to look at her mom's car, but it wasn't there. It had only been seconds since we called. 5 minutes later, her mom showed up, and her little sister was in the car. We hopped in. The little sister wanted to go down the slide. We watched her from the car, and she came back saying, "Mom, Jess, there's a funny deer standing up over there." And sure enough, it's a goddamn deer on its hind legs. I don't know what this is. I'm in Oregon, which from what I've read isn't skinwalker territory. I read a comment on a post in another sub about voice takers, but I can't find anything on them. My most recent encounter was 3 a.m. when I was downstairs with my two large dogs, and my Doberman started barking at the window. I looked outside, and the deer was standing on its hind legs again, staring at the window from the road. I went outside in the morning, and one of the neighborhood stray cats was dead by the tree in front of my house. It could be unrelated, but it really freaked me out. Does this ring any bells for anyone? I know it sounds like a skinwalker, but I'm not sure. This is an experience I had while backpacking in the Appalachian trails. A friend and I had just finished hiking up a long, steep hill. We were ready for lunch. After some discussion, we decided we would eat at the shelter that was 2 miles down and up another hill. We knew there would be water there. Hot and thirsty, we found ourselves at the shelter, drinking the water as fast as we could fill it up. There was just one other person there, and naturally, we initially thought it was a fellow hiker. But when I got a better look at him, I could see that he was rather disheveled, carrying an old backpack with holes in it, and was digging for crumbs out of the bottom of a Fritos bag. When he went to throw it away, we saw him grab something from the garbage and put it in his backpack. This far out, it's rare to see homeless people since there aren't a lot of ways to get out here, besides driving yourself. Not a great place for food either, so he was very out of place. He started to approach us, getting close enough to where I thought he might say something. So when he didn't, my friend and I asked if he was backpacking or day hiking. Never making eye contact, he sort of muttered out, backpacking. We then asked if he was section hiking or through hiking, as in doing the entire trail. He looks at us with this weird look, saying, "Oh, I'm just hiking through." After a little bit of talking and avoiding all of our questions, he just quickly said, "I gotta go." As he packed his bag, we asked what his trail name was so we could look out for him in the logbooks. He clearly had no idea what we were talking about. This struck us as odd because anyone who hikes the Appalachian trails knows what a trail name is, and usually has one that they go by. After sort of explaining what it meant, he said, "Oh, right, it's Hatchet." Which was obviously a load of crap because this guy looked at a small axe he was holding in his hand when he said this. Well, we said goodbye, continued hiking, my friend and I discussing how strange that guy was and moving on. Eventually, we reached our camping spot where we got settled in for the night. My friend and I use hammocks for sleeping, so I had my backpack wrapped around the tree that my hammock was tied to. I'm woken up to my entire hammock shaking. I quickly look in the direction of my backpack and I see Hatchet rustling through it. I yelled out, "Hey!" And he looked in my hammock, stared at me for a good second, and then bolted. By the time I got out of my hammock, he was nowhere to be seen. I looked through my bag. From what I could tell, he'd just taken a pack of tuna. In the morning, we discovered he'd also managed to get away with my friend's granola bars. Since he truly only seemed to go after food, we decided maybe he was homeless and had made his way out here somehow. We finished our route through the trails and never saw him again. We saw his face again, though, when we got back into town and ate lunch at the small diner. Turns out our friend Hatchet was on the run. There was a wanted poster hanging up on the door. 2 weeks earlier, he'd mugged a couple of people, leaving one guy pretty bloodied up. We gave our statement to the police, but never heard if they caught him or not. The whole thing was pretty freaky, but we were really happy that he was looking for food that night and not a fight. This happened to me when I was pretty little, like 6 or 7. I was camping with my older brother and my mom. We all set up our sleeping bags in the tent that we shared. I'm not sure what time it was, just that it was dark, and we eventually all fell asleep. The next time I opened my eyes, I saw bits of dark sky and tops of trees. It was still dark, but I knew that I should see the top of the tent. And as I looked side to side, I saw that there was no mom, no older brother. I was somewhere in the middle of the woods, still in my sleeping bag. I had no idea where I was or where our tent was. I just remember that I screamed for my mom, and I could hear her calling back. She sounded panicked. She also sounded far away. I kept following her voice, eventually making my way back to her and the tent. I don't remember anything after that, just falling asleep. To this day, I have no idea how I ended up in the middle of the woods, still zipped inside my sleeping bag. It gives me chills thinking back to it. My family recently bought a beautiful but overgrown piece of land in the Kootenays of British Columbia, Canada. It's a wonderful place, but my dad had been a bit frustrated with the amount of work it would take to make the place really livable. I thought it was strange that the previous owners seemed to be in a rush to sell the land, but I left it up to the uneven ground and abundance of plants in the area. My family brought their trailer to the land and were staying in it, while I had set up a small tent nearby since there wasn't enough room for me. Soon after we started staying there, my dad and I were comfortably sitting around our fire pit, stargazing and listening to the sounds of the land, when we started to hear the shrieks of something that was certainly inhuman, but also unlike any animal either of us had ever heard. It was a shrill, yet guttural growl that was extremely drawn out and loud. My first guess was that a bear or cougar got cornered, but listening more closely, I quickly crushed that assumption. I started to distinguish the growl of a small bear, but that wasn't the source of the strange shriek. It soon started to sound like a bear was cornering something, and the creature was trying to make a last-ditch escape while screaming in pain. Now, I know you're probably thinking, must have been a cougar or something, but I've heard a cougar in a fight before. This was not a cougar. Its shrieks and howls almost sounded demonic. Soon after the noises stopped, my dad and I both decided it would be best to head to bed. While laying in my tent, I started to hear the unmistakable sound of a large creature roaming around our site. After approaching, I heard it settle into place, almost like it was sitting down or getting comfortable. I started to worry that the unidentifiable creature from earlier was stalking us, until I worked up the courage to peek out my tent window. In the spot I'd heard the creature approach from, I saw not a horrifying monstrosity, but a beautiful black bear. I would normally be afraid upon seeing this, except I made eye contact with the bear and felt an overwhelming sense of safety. I know it sounds crazy, but it almost felt like the bear was watching over us to protect us from something. Soon after noticing the bear, I heard that blood-curdling screech of the unidentifiable creature. Much closer now. When the bear heard this, it tensed up, brought itself to its feet, and began to growl menacingly. Only a moment after the bear began to growl, I heard a much larger creature than the bear run off in the opposite direction. I swung my head to see where the noise was coming from and got a glance of an incredibly large, deer-like animal. I didn't get a good look at it, but I remember seeing thin, skeletal, long, pale arms and legs that ended with hooves. It was covered in a very dark, blood-like substance, implying maybe that it had been injured recently. When I saw this, my breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't force myself to look away. I saw the tree sway and break where it was running, and then it stopped a far distance away from our land and let out one more shriek. The few birds that were awake in the area flew away in fear, and I shuddered. I looked back to the bear, and it was once again sitting, looking at me with its kind of protective eyes. I've never been more grateful to have a bear living by.